On social media, people had posted how a man of God, Jimmy Swaggart, died. How could anyone consider this charlatan to be a man of God?
Jimmy Swaggart.
What they found hidden in Pastor Jimmy Swaggart's study Bible will leave you speechless. Imagine opening a Bible and not being able to tell, at a glance, where God's words end and one man's opinion begins. Now imagine that Bible sitting on more than 1 million nightstands, pulpits, and church shelves around the world, printed under the name of a preacher who once wept on live television and confessed to a sin he refused to name. That Bible is real. It's called the Expositor's Study Bible, and it carries the name of Jimmy Swaggart in red letters, the same color traditionally reserved for the words of Jesus Christ. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why that single choice of ink became one of the most quietly controversial decisions in modern televangelism, and why it says more about the man behind it than almost anything else in his long and turbulent career. Jimmy Swaggart passed away in 2025 at the age of 90, closing out a ministry that spanned more than 5 decades. But long before his death, and long after his most famous scandal, one project outlived every headline: a study Bible that he poured himself into, literally. Most study Bibles keep human commentary at arm's length from Scripture. You'll find notes at the bottom of the page, in the margins, or bundled into a separate section entirely. That structure exists for a reason. It lets a reader see clearly where the ancient text ends and where a modern person's interpretation begins. Swaggart's Expositor's Study Bible broke from that structure almost entirely. Instead of placing his commentary off to the side, he had it woven directly into the body of the King James text, verse after verse, so that his explanations sit right beside, and sometimes right inside, the scripture itself. That alone would have raised eyebrows. But the choice of color turned raised eyebrows into real controversy. In red-letter Bibles, a publishing tradition that goes back more than a century, red ink is used exclusively to mark the words attributed to Jesus. It's a visual signal, a way of saying, this part is different, this part carries a unique weight. Readers have grown up trusting that convention. So when readers opened Swaggart's Bible and found his own commentary printed in that same red ink, many didn't know what to make of it. Some longtime supporters shrugged it off as a stylistic choice that simply made the notes easier to spot on the page. Others were far less forgiving. Reviewers and critics online have openly called the formatting confusing at best and irreverent at worst, with some describing it as an accidental, or not so accidental, elevation of Swaggart's own voice to a level usually reserved for scripture alone. It's worth saying plainly, nobody has produced evidence that Swaggart intended to claim his words were divinely inspired in the way Christ's words are. But intent is a hard thing to prove from a printed page, and the visual effect speaks for itself. Whether he meant it that way or not, opening that book puts you in a position where you have to actively work to separate the ancient text from the modern commentary, because the formatting doesn't do that work for you. First published in the mid-2000s, the Expositor's Study Bible spread further than almost anyone outside Swaggart's own ministry expected. It was translated into major world languages, distributed internationally, and by the publisher's own account, more than 1 million copies made it into print. Different sources over the years have cited different numbers, some higher, some suggesting large batches were given away free to pastors rather than sold, and there's no fully independent audit that settles the exact figure once and for all. What isn't in dispute is the scale. This wasn't a niche pamphlet handed out after a Sunday service. It was, and remains, one of the most widely distributed pieces of Swaggart's entire ministry, arguably reaching more homes than his television broadcasts ever did on their own. It's still sold today through his ministry's outlets, bound in leather editions, gold-leafed pages, complete with maps and reference sections, marketed less as a niche curiosity and more as the flagship product of everything Swaggart spent his life building. Beyond the red ink, there are smaller editorial fingerprints scattered throughout the text. Swaggart consistently capitalized the word cross, a small typographic choice that puts extra visual weight on the symbol that sat at the very center of his theology. He also included well over 100 notes that push back on or reinterpret conventional translations of specific passages, steering the reader toward his own doctrinal conclusions rather than leaving the interpretation open. For his most devoted followers, this was exactly the point, A lifetime of Bible study distilled into something that could sit in their hands and guide them verse by verse. Reader reviews of the Bible, even today, split sharply down the middle. Some call it the most beloved study tool they've ever owned, describing it as a resource that finally made difficult passages make sense. Others call the format distracting at best, and, at worst, something close to disrespectful toward the text it claims to illuminate. For his critics, including some theologians who reviewed the work publicly, it read as something closer to a personal theological system dressed up as a study aid, one that risked training readers to see Swaggart's interpretation as inseparable from the text itself. To really understand why this Bible generated so much debate, you have to understand the man who built it, because the story of Jimmy Swaggart is really two stories running in parallel, one of extraordinary influence and one of very public failure. Swaggart rose out of rural Louisiana in the 1970s and 80s to become one of the biggest names in American televangelism, but his path there started decades earlier in poverty, in a family that moved between church basements and small rented rooms. He was a cousin of rock and roll pioneer Jerry Lee Lewis and country singer Mickey Gilley, and all three grew up surrounded by the same raw, Pentecostal musical energy of the Louisiana Bayou. While his cousins chased fame in secular music, Swaggart chose the pulpit, and he brought that same intensity with him. He built a career first as a gospel recording artist, selling millions of records and earning a Grammy nomination before television became his true platform. At his peak, his weekly broadcasts reached thousands of stations across more than 100 countries. He built a sprawling ministry empire in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, complete with a television network, a Bible college, and a home church, family worship center, that functioned more like a small city of worship than a single congregation. Millions of viewers tuned in weekly, and his international crusades drew massive crowds across Latin America, Africa, and beyond. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful religious broadcasters of his generation, commanding an audience and a donor base that rivaled some of the biggest names in American religious media. That power came with an aggressive streak that Swaggart didn't hide. Through the mid-1980s, he positioned himself as a guardian of doctrinal purity within Pentecostal circles, and he wasn't shy about naming names. In 1986, he publicly exposed a fellow Assemblies of God pastor, Marvin Gorman, over allegations of extramarital affairs, a move that effectively ended Gorman's ministry. Gorman later sued Swaggart for defamation and won a significant settlement, arguing that Swaggart had exaggerated the situation to eliminate a regional rival whose growing congregation had started to compete with his own. The following year, Swaggart turned his attention to Jim Bakker, the PTL televangelist already engulfed in his own scandal, and Swaggart's public condemnation played a real role in accelerating Bakker's downfall and the eventual collapse of the PTL ministry. For a moment, Swaggart was informally nicknamed the Pentecostal Pope, a man seemingly powerful enough to make or break the careers of other preachers with a single sermon. Then, in 1988, the story turned on him. Swaggart was photographed leaving a motel outside New Orleans after meeting with a woman named Deborah Murphy, who later described a pattern of paid encounters. The fallout was immediate and massive. Swaggart went on television and delivered one of the most famous confessions in broadcast history, breaking down in tears in front of millions of viewers as he repeated the words, "I have sinned," without ever specifying exactly what that sin was. Some viewers found the moment genuinely moving, a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a man who usually projected total certainty. Others saw it as carefully managed damage control, vague by design, crafted to preserve as much of his ministry as possible. The Assemblies of God disciplined him, calling for a lengthy period away from the pulpit, and Swaggart's relationship with the denomination fractured. He eventually continued his ministry independently rather than fully submit to the terms laid out for his restoration. Just a few years later, in 1991, he was pulled over in California in an incident involving another woman found in his car, reigniting the same questions all over again and reopening wounds that had never fully healed. His own son Donnie has spoken publicly over the years about the toll these repeated scandals took on the family and the ministry alike, describing a period of real turmoil behind the scenes even as broadcasts continued as though little had changed. The financial picture of the ministry tells its own version of this rise and fall. At the height of his influence in the mid-1980s, Swaggart's organization was pulling in enormous sums annually through donations, broadcasts, and crusades, funding not just the television network but international missions, a printing operation, and a growing Bible college. After the scandal broke, giving collapsed, and it took years for the ministry to stabilize on a much smaller scale. There have also been long-standing, well-documented allegations from journalists and foreign governments that Swaggart's ministry provided material support in the 1980s to Renamo, a rebel movement in Mozambique's civil war that was accused of serious human rights abuses. Copies of Swaggart's own literature, translated into Portuguese, were reportedly found at a captured rebel headquarters in 1985, and further accusations surfaced again in the early 1990s from Zimbabwean officials and independent journalists. Swaggart's ministry has never been criminally charged in connection with these allegations, and it's important to be clear that an accusation is not a conviction, but the allegations have followed his legacy for decades and remain part of the historical record, unresolved and disputed to this day. It's against this backdrop, a preacher who built and nearly lost an empire, who exposed other men's failures before his own became public, who wept on camera and then kept preaching anyway, that his study Bible starts to look less like a random publishing decision and more like a window into how he saw his own authority. In 1997, years after the scandal, Swaggart announced what he called a revelation of the cross, a personal theological insight he said reshaped his understanding of salvation. He taught it with total conviction, framing it as something the church at large had overlooked for centuries, and he grew increasingly pointed toward other well-known preachers, including prosperity gospel figures like Kenneth Copeland, whom he publicly criticized for what he saw as a distortion of the gospel message. To supporters, this was Swaggart at his theological best, laser-focused on the cross of Christ as the center of the gospel, cutting through what he viewed as decades of watered-down preaching. To critics, the tone of certainty, the sense that he alone had finally seen what everyone else had missed, echoed patterns theologians have long warned about in charismatic religious leadership, where a single figure's personal insight starts to function less like teaching and more like final authority over an entire movement. And that brings us back to the Bible itself, because that same instinct, the conviction that his own interpretation deserved to sit as close to the text as possible, is exactly what you find printed on every page of the Expositor's Study Bible. It isn't scripture altered. The King James text inside is the same King James text you'd find anywhere else. But the reading experience is different, because his voice is never more than a sentence away from the words of the prophets and apostles, printed in the one-color tradition had always kept sacred. Whether you see that as a devoted teacher trying to make the Bible easier to understand, or as a wounded but unrepentant man quietly asserting his own authority one more time, probably depends on how you already feel about Jimmy Swaggart going into the story. What's not really in dispute is that millions of people now own a Bible where a controversial preacher's personal commentary sits in red ink, verse by verse, inside the text of Scripture itself. That's not a rumor or an urban legend. It's sitting on shelves right now in multiple languages, in homes on more than one continent, passed down through families who have followed his ministry for generations. And it raises a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. How much of what we read as sacred is really just familiar, and how easy is it, even for well-meaning readers, to stop noticing where one voice ends and another begins? Jimmy Swaggart's story is ultimately not a simple one. He was a man capable of extraordinary reach and real generosity toward his followers, building a ministry that trained pastors, funded missions, and gave a global audience decades of televised worship. And at the same time, he was a man whose private failures repeatedly collided with the very standards he preached from the pulpit, failures that played out in front of the same cameras that made him famous. His study Bible is, in a strange way, the most honest artifact he ever produced, not because of what it says about Scripture, but because of what it reveals about how he saw his own voice within it. Decades from now, long after the headlines about motels and confessions have faded from memory, that red ink will still be there on the page, a permanent, physical record of one preacher's decision to stand as close to the sacred text as the printing press would allow, for better or worse, in the eyes of everyone who ever opened that book. If this look behind the pages of one of the most talked about study Bibles in modern televangelism gave you something to think about, let us know what stood out to you most. And subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories behind the biggest names in faith and media.